Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Diplomatic History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Andrew Pace, the host of the channel. Today, we'll be talking to Stephen Simon about his new book, Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East, which was published in 2023 by Penguin Press. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
In your preface to your book, you note that your book is not only a history of U.S. entanglement in the Middle East, but also a memoir. Can you begin the interview by telling us about your professional background and how that frames your book?
Of course. My professional background is, it's a little it's a little bit scattered, and maybe hard to follow. My first career, such as it was in ancient history. It also is ancient history, but it was, ancient history at the time. As an undergraduate, I did classics and Near Eastern languages, and then I went on to study, I suppose, what would be called Roman Near East. That was my thing. I wasn't really very good at it, and I ultimately left the PhD program I was in and just sort of wandered around for a while, doing a number of things. I worked for an evangelical publishing company for a while, providing consulting advice for movies about Jesus that were being filmed in Israel for use in vacation Bible schools in the United States, things like that. And then I somehow segued from there into New York City government, where I was the legislative coordinator for the Human Resources Administration, which administered public assistance and medical services delivery in New York to the indigent. It was it was a bit disconnected, but anyway, then I went from there to Princeton, where I got a degree in international relations, and then went from there into government. First working on the defense budget at the White House, and then going into the State Department. I was in the State Department for a while, and then in the course of which I did two White House tours, one as the NSC Senior Director for Counterterrorism in the Clinton administration, and then NSC Senior Director for Middle East and North Africa in the Obama administration. And then, between those stints and afterward, I mostly taught at a succession of schools, colleges and universities, principally in the Northeast, but also worked working on classified programs at the Rand Corporation. I was a Middle Eastern Studies Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I worked as a consultant for the Court of the Crown Prince in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates for a while, and I don't know, lived in Manama, Bahrain for a while, doing some think tank stuff. It essentially has been all over the place, and now, here I am at the University of Washington at the Jackson School for International Studies, and just in the twilight of my career, playing Goodbye, Mr. Chips. So that's really it. And writing these books, the one that we're talking about today, and one that I've embarked on now, which will be a history of the U.S. global war on terror.
Sounds great. Obviously, you've had an enormous amount of experience in government, and it sounds like out of government. So, an eclectic lifetime of experience working on international issues. Your book is entitled Grand Delusion. Can you tell us what that Grand Delusion was, or perhaps we should refer to it more as Grand Delusions, a series of aspirations and illusions that the United States pursued for 40 years in the Middle East?
Yeah, so the reason I chose the singular, and I did ponder, the question that you just raised when I was thinking about titles for the book, is that there was such a strong family resemblance among the different delusions that I thought they could be usefully grouped. And the classic formulation in this period of that grand delusion was George H.W. Bush's New World Order. And administrations before George H.W. Bush and afterwards entertained many of these same many delusions that could be regarded as nested or subsets, nested within or subsets of the New World Order trope. And so in Carter, there was an ethical imperative to foreign policy, and that sort of signified a kind of a new U.S. approach to the world, where ethical considerations would somehow trump realpolitik. And then in the Reagan administration, there was the Freedom Crusade. That was, sort of closely entwined with concepts of a new world order. And then, of course, there was the New World Order itself, advocated or really declared by the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. In Clinton, it was enlargement. In Clinton, it was enlargement, and that was also, in a sense, eschatological, because it was inspired by Frank Fukuyama's End of History, which emerged at about that time, and Fukuyama was the deputy director of the State Department policy planning staff. Undoubtedly participated in those discussions, and in fact, he would have been selected for that job because his analytical thinking about international politics and the evolution of politics would have been appealing to the administration. Now, I reached out to Fukuyama about this, and he said, well, he really had no influence, on what was going on. But that was a tribute, I think, to his humility, because you could trace the thread pretty clearly. You don't need an electron microscope, to do that. And enlargement, which was the Clinton administration's version of New World Order, that is to say, the enlargement of the world of democracies, and the transformation of the last holdouts, those who hadn't gotten Fukuyama's memo, would be compelled to make the transition to democracy, and therefore, putting my old theology hat back on, paved the way for the kingdom of God. So that was Clinton. That was their delusion. George W. Bush, had had a profound illusion too, which came to be dubbed the freedom agenda, which was in a somewhat of a perverse way a nice adaptation of Clinton's enlargement doctrine. But then, and Obama kind of carried this through, at least the first part of his first term, where his team and he himself were, I think, attracted to the idea of reputation to protect, which the lineage of which could be traced directly to George H.W. Bush and the attributes of his New World Order. So the lineage, the parentage, I suppose you might say, of this idea originated way back then in a very different administration. But the results for Obama were so negative in his first 2 years that being the kind of decision maker he was, and in some ways he was sort of classic senior executive, he just abandoned all that. And that was it. After that, there was no grand delusion regulating Obama's foreign and security policy, and that was certainly true of his successor, Donald Trump, and really up until today, I suppose. It described Biden's foreign policy as well. I mean, Biden placed a strategic emphasis on alliances and so forth, but in terms of the Middle East, when you look at the only sort of full dress description of the administration's Middle East policy in a speech given by his Middle East advisor, Brett McGurk, was classic realpolitik. I mean, you can scour that document, but you will not see any word deriving from the Greek stem, demos. There's, there ain't no democratization there. So, so you had this trend. Certainly, I'm just looking at it conservatively. Let's say you had this trend beginning with Reagan, where you had these grand ideas, these seemingly ideological impulses driving increasing interventionism, U.S. interventionism in the Middle East, which peaks, in a way, with the Second Gulf War, in the way that Suez in 1956 represented, Britain's peak of involvement in the Middle East, and then it begins to decline as these ideas, these grand delusions became risible, in a way. Maybe that's putting it too strongly, but I don't think so. In any case, the marginal costs, attached to pursuit of these grand delusions, certainly, exceeded the returns, the marginal returns, and by quite a large margin. So they tended to fade out in a pretty dramatic way. So yes, grand delusions, but united thematically, really. So hence the title.
You also highlight this pattern of retrenchment and engagement that went on through successive administrations in the pursuit of these grand ideals. And one of the things that I thought was so, I guess, ironic was that in the pursuit of these grand ideas, the United States and these various presidential administrations ended up making these incredible Faustian bargains, whether that was in pursuit of engagement in the Middle East or retrenchment. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of those bargains that you see as ultimately being not worth the cost.
I mean, I suppose, readers of the book, including yourself, will have concluded, or would conclude, that I didn't think any of it was worth the cost. Regardless of the Faustian bargain that was supposed to produce gains in some way. So I rather think that the administration, in terms of Faustian bargains, was. Let me just step back and clarify this term Faustian bargain in this context, as I think you mean it. And if not, correct me, and we can get back on track. But the bargains were Faustian in that the grand delusions the United States was pursuing had heavy costs, but in the view of these administrations, not costs absorbed by the United States, but rather costs that were transferred to Middle Eastern peoples. So that was the deal with the devil. So if the United States is to bring about this better world, then it has to do some pretty dramatic things. And the best example really of that, I mean, there's a string of examples, as you point out, but the most striking, because it's a moment of 10 seconds or 15 seconds that's captured on video, is an interview on 60 Minutes in 1996, I think. It would have to have been 1996, with then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And her interviewer says, remarks on a study that had just been completed by the United Nations, which indicated or estimated that upwards of 560,000 Iraqi children had perished in consequence of U.S. backed sanctions, economic sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, in pursuit of program of regime change and allegedly the search for weapons of mass destruction. And Albright's a response to the interviewer's elaboration that, well, that's more than the number of children who were killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. She says, well, it was a hard call, but we thought it was worth it. Now, on many levels, that's kind of a breathtaking, statement, because she certainly didn't dispute the fact that there'd been this terrible cost. But if you sort of knew what was going on, and this is clarified in the book, this interview was conducted almost a year after the CIA declared in a publicly released, assessment that there were no WMD in Iraq. Okay, they just weren't there. And the benefits of somehow dislodging Saddam Hussein, who was, at that point already fading as a leader, and it's just really kind of astonishing. Now that is one hell of a Faustian bargain. And so I think throughout this period, the U.S. had been really heedless, or if not heedless, then certainly willing to accept and justify as worthwhile the impact of its interventions on the people of the region.
Yeah, one of the things I think your narrative does really well is discussing this interplay, or these tensions, as you call them, between intentionalists in government, policymakers, cabinet officials, the president himself, and the consequentialists, people on the ground in the Middle East who are bearing the burdens of American policies. And it was astonishing to me how well-intentioned American officials thought their policies were, and how divorced they actually seemed to be from the consequences of their policies when it came to their impacts on human beings in the Middle East. But one of the things I found so curious was that you mentioned in a number of administrations that the Reagan administration or the Clinton administration failed to take heed of their own intelligence analyses about what the effect of U.S. policies might be. And in fact, you commented a number of times that it was actually par for the course for policymakers to dismiss intelligence analysis. Why is that the case? And why then what's the point of having good intelligence if we never pay heed to it?
Well, yeah, no, that's a great question. So the reason, now that we've discussed why it's singular and not plural, the reason I chose delusion as a word in the first place is because what characterizes delusion is not just a dumb idea. What makes a dumb idea a delusion is when it becomes impervious to contradictory evidence. So a delusion is just a bad idea, but it's a bad idea that the holder of the idea will not accept conflicting evidence which shows that it's not a very good idea. And one of the reasons I included so much about the U.S. intelligence during these various administrations, apart from the fact that the CIA has a fantastic website called the library, the CIA Library Reading Room, which has a lot of great material in it. And then, of course, there's a program at George Washington University that cobbles together a lot of intelligence documents that have been declassified either by U.S. agencies themselves or through foreign intelligence. I'm so besotted with illusions with acronyms that I can't remember what FOIA stands for, but it's it's a means by which citizens can petition the U.S. government for the release of classified information.
The Freedom of Information Act.
Yes. So so there's a lot of material out there to work with if you're an historian or just a kind of ordinary writer like myself, and it was pretty clear that the intelligence was routinely disregarded, and that didn't surprise me as a as a fact. What did surprise me was the consistency of it. In other words, you work in government long enough, you see intelligence disregarded, quite frequently, but you're dealing with things on such a case basis, and you don't really think of these episodes as being really connected. Every issue you work on is separate and new, and you just deal with it and then move on. But it's only when you look at the extended record as an outsider that you see the consistency with which intelligence is disregarded. That is, intelligence that doesn't support the direction of the administration's policy or its instinctive views on the situation that they're grappling with, whatever that situation is. There's a famous anecdote from the Lyndon Johnson administration where it's really great because it illustrates this phenomenon. You're probably familiar with this one, but it illustrates the durability of this phenomenon. He's receiving these intelligence reports. And you work on Vietnam, so I'm sure you must have heard this. But he gets these intelligence reports that run counter to what his administration is trying to do. And he says, as the West Texas Hill farmer that he was, or that he purported to be, he said, "Here I am. I'm just milking the cow, and I've just got a wonderful bucket of fresh milk, and then the damn cow just swishes her shit-stained tail right through the pail." And in this case, the shit-stained tail was the intelligence that seemed to show that his policies were not going to work or were not working. And that's how policymakers feel about intelligence, and intelligence agencies generally understand this perfectly well. And it's created a phenomenon that you might anticipate it would, which is that intelligence agencies, senior intelligence officials will shape their analyses to either conform to or at least not contradict the instincts of policymakers. Because if you're the head of an intelligence agency, what you prize more than anything is access to your principal, is access to the president, the national security advisor, and you're stuck on the horns of a dilemma, because if you do speak truth to power, then you'll be cut out. Then you'll lose the access that you need, because it's really the reason for your being, right, is to have access to the president and be advising him. So you're going to try to square that circle by presenting your findings in a way that don't alienate the president or his national security advisor. Now, sometimes there's just no way to avoid that. So you'll be simply ignored. Now, sometimes, that results in leaks to the press and so forth. And one can see daylight just by looking at the newspaper. You can see daylight between the administration, between the White House and its own security folks, its own intelligence folks. It's really, if you're an intelligence, official, it can be very frustrating. What's striking in the material that I've compiled in the book is the number of times the intelligence community was actually willing to counter the administration's expectations and the validity of its objectives. And then, as you're pointing out, Andrew, it's correspondingly striking how the administration felt free simply to disregard that countervailing information. And it's sort of interesting the way they remember that, because I conducted interviews for this book, of course, and I interviewed one of the national security advisors, from the Clinton days, about the enormous toll that U.S. policy was taking on ordinary Iraqis. Well, I was at the White House at the time, so I saw all this coming across my desk, and the intelligence reports were slugged, for the White House, distribution, the White House and so forth. And I said, well, well, surely, I said to my interlocutor, I said, well, surely you saw these, these reports. What did you make of them? Or if you didn't see the reports, I'm sure you were told, because that's just how the system works. And his reply was, well, I didn't know. And he said if he had known, well, he would have, initiated a change in policy. But I'm not one to contradict people on things like that. I'm fairly sure that, well, he just remembered it that way. So intelligence reports can be rejected. They can be ignored. They can be sort of suppressed, psychologically, like there's something of a cognitive dissonance on the policymaker's part when he or she receives unfriendly intelligence, that is to say, intelligence unfriendly to his or her policy preferences. And so that cognitive dissonance is resolved by simply, suppressing awareness of these views, of these intelligence assessments. That what I've just laid out is, by the way, it's a perennial phenomenon, and it's not a feature of Democratic administrations or Republican administrations. It's just it's baked into the policy formation and implementation pie that every administration, regardless of political stripe, has in the oven.
And that was striking to me too, that these intelligence, I don't know if I'd say intelligence failures as much as intelligence negligence, wasn't unique to any particular administration or any particular party. But one of the things I also wanted to ask was about the contingency of events in this history, because I think one of the hardest things to do in writing history is to put yourselves in the shoes of historical actors and look forwards, rather than to embrace the human tendency to use hindsight, to view history simply from the present looking backwards. Because when we do that, I think there is a temptation to think that all of this was inevitable, that these administrations, whether Republican or Democratic, were motivated by these delusions. And of course, when they were impervious to intelligence or evidence, they were bound to make these bad decisions. They were bound to end up making these Faustian bargains that would cost thousands of lives. But your work shows very strongly that none of this was inevitable. The Gulf War didn't have to unfold the way it did. 9/11 didn't have to unfold the way it did. Um, can you talk a little bit about let's take 9/11 for example. Why wasn't it inevitable? Why what were the sort of contingent points in U.S. involvement in the Middle East?
Well, on 9/11, there were a couple of things at work. So we all know, because it's been studied so closely, that and there were serious mistakes that were made in the U.S. government in both the law enforcement and intelligence communities, and these. So there were those, but then there were policymakers' errors as well, in two respects. Okay, so prior to 9/11, the United States failed to put the kind of pressure on Saudi Arabia that might have made it more difficult for the hijackers to get into the United States and establish themselves there, to prepare for and carry out the attack. And that was a function of, the perceived role of Saudi Arabia in American security writ large. I mean, and the American economy writ large. And the United States, even though it was extremely concerned about Saudi-funded organizations involved in the attacks against the U.S. embassies in 1998 in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, they did not really push the Saudis for the kind of assistance that would have been required to uncover the Saudi officials in the United States who were alluded to in the 9/11 Commission report, who apparently facilitated the hijackers in the United States. So that was one policy issue, and the other policy issue was, that of a different administration, the George W. Bush administration, which had its own sort of delusion, and the delusion was the only thing that matters are states. And there was a tendency, no, not even it was more than a tendency. There was a deep conviction that sub-state actors didn't matter, that they were ineffectual, that they couldn't affect the United States in any way. And of course, the counterterrorism team at the White House at that time pled with the new administration, with their new bosses, George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and so forth, begged them to understand that this conception was wrong, and that there was a sub-state actor poised to attack the United States in a devastating way. But the new administration's conception of the international order just got in the way, and as a result, the measures that would have to have been taken to protect the United States against this attack were not taken. So, and by the way, the intelligence, on the impending attack was voluminous, and it was disregarded, by the administration, and quite astonishingly so.
Yeah, you and Dan Benjamin, I believe, had assembled some of the evidence that suggested that Bin Laden and Al Qaeda were plotting and preparing imminent attack on the United States. Um, you you conclude your review of what is it, 8 administrations from Carter to Trump. You conclude by saying that since World War II, the United States' goal has been to secure Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I think in your assessment, you believe Washington has generally succeeded, but the main question, of course, is but at what cost? And you conclude your book with a little bit of a discussion about the current Biden administration. And you said that the future of U.S. involvement is not likely to resemble the past or the present. And it seems to me that you've written your book at a time when U.S. policy in the Middle East is poised between continuity and change. Just in closing, I wanted to ask whether you feel like the current war in Gaza and Hamas's recent attack on Israel last month, whether you think that may lead to, whether you think that will push the United States towards continuity or towards change.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it's been on my mind, constantly over the past few weeks.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So, look, I think your characterization of the situation is really shrewd. I mean, the administration is at a kind of tipping point.
An inflection point, as the Biden administration likes to say.
Inflection point. Yes. Oh, I have a bad inflection. I can't come to work today. So, yeah, the Biden administration for the first year and a half simply ignored the Middle East, and in continuity with its Biden administration predecessor and Obama in his second term, except for Obama's Iran deal. So, it all looked as though, the trend was continuing just as predicted. Then China arose as a serious strategic challenge for the United States, or at least it's perceived that way. I'm not a China expert. I don't know, but that's how the administration was clearly approaching its relationship with China. It was certainly rivalrous and potentially adversarial. Okay, and in a situation like that, administrations have to do some serious planning. Well, what happens if push comes to shove here, and we wind up in a serious fight with China? Is it going to be a long war? Is it going to be a short war? How do we prepare for this? And that would instantly raise the question of Chinese access to Gulf oil in a contingency, because that would have an impact on actually how long China could sustain combat operations in a long war with the United States, because China gets so much of its energy resources, which are growing steadily for fossil fuels, from Saudi Arabia. So now this concern was not something the administration was going to be talking about publicly. because why would they do that? They don't want to put the Saudis on the spot. They don't want to make things worse with China than they already are. This is all based on some kind of, contingency planning. Who knows? It may never become important, but you can't be too careful. So you go to the Saudis in a way that you wouldn't have even a year before, or maybe 2 years before. And you say, well, if things get tough with China, you got to keep them out. You're not going to give them any oil, and you're going to keep them out of your facilities, and you're going to do all that. And Saudi Arabia says, well, yeah. And why would we do that? The United States says, because at the end of the day, we're your bigger friend, and we will do things for you. So, for example, we will give you a security commitment. We will sign a defense treaty with you that looks very much like the NATO treaty. And since you're so interested in it, we will allow you and facilitate your acquisition of an entire nuclear fuel cycle. So a nuclear reactor complex that will enable you to enrich uranium on your own soil, uranium that's mined within Saudi Arabia. And that's something that the United States would ordinarily never agree to. So the United States is saying, well, we can do a lot for you if you make certain guarantees to us. And we'll also need some sort of, concessionary arrangement on oil prices, which is to say you're going to have to disassociate yourself within OPEC Plus from Russia, and stop pursuing production cuts that enable Russia to carry on its war against Ukraine. So, there's something big going on there, but most of it is not anything that the United States could talk about, certainly in advance of a deal. So you need cover, and the cover that the United States devises is Saudi-Israeli normalization. That's bound to get a lot of attention, and a lot of favorable interest, and then the emerging story becomes the United States is willing to sign a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia and give it access to the entire nuclear fuel cycle in return for the Saudis agreeing to normalization of relations with Israel. So if you're kind of an old hand, you look at this and you say, that's strange. I mean, Saudi-Israeli normalization, well, that's a nice thing, certainly. Everybody's wanted that for a long time, but that has nothing to do with American interests. Not every good thing matters for, U.S. strategic interest, and that's one of those good things that doesn't. So why would the United States make these sweeping arrangements with Saudi Arabia in return for that? A defense treaty that could drag the United States into a war? A precedent-shattering nuclear industrial arrangement with Saudi Arabia that could enable them to build a bomb if they decide to do it. Those are such big things, and in return for what? Saudi-Israeli normalization? I mean, the United States in this picture is making big strategic moves towards Saudi Arabia in return for something that is distinctly not strategic. for the United States. So, if you're an old hand, you say, okay, well, what's really going on here? And what's really going on there is China. So I say all this in response to your question about this inflection point and whether anything is changing and what's in effect. So what's new here? And the China issue was the factor that drove the beginning of a U.S. re-engagement in the form of its negotiations with the Saudis on Saudi-Israeli normalization. So that was the first kind of interesting shift. Now, was that? I mean, on the one hand, that was undoubtedly kind of a return to engaging, in the Middle East. But on the other, it was a function not of U.S. interest in the Middle East per se, but U.S. interest in managing the potential course of a conflict with China. So a kind of huge geostrategic kind of thing that transcended any U.S. interest in the Middle East per se. And then on the heels of that, you have this Gaza detonation. And any administration that did not want to be dragged into a war would have to maximize that goal by getting involved early. And it's paradoxical because you say, well, if you want to stay out, well, why are you getting in? Well, sometimes the only way you can stay out is by getting in. And just to clarify that, deep Zen paradox, if this war escalates to include Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah, then the United States will probably get involved because Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah will wind up killing Americans. And so that's sort of, inevitable. And the United States had to get involved early, in part to push off the Israeli ground incursion to create space for certain important things. And one was prepare the ground for humanitarian aid to Gaza in this, horrible scenario. And the other was to avert the possibility of escalation by deterring Hezbollah and Iran from widening the war in a significant way, and especially a way that could threaten Americans. And there, the United States sent two carrier strike groups to the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a wing, on each one of those decks, or below decks, and that's a total of 180 airplanes. And there are two carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf. I mean, that's a big chunk of U.S. Carrier-based air power. And it's all there, in the region, and it's all there to say to Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran, as the president put it, just don't. So, so these manifestations of U.S. interest and involvement in the current crisis, I think, are necessary from the administration's perspective to reduce the probability that the U.S. will get dragged in some major way, because they don't want to be, for very good reason. I don't know if that was a very helpful, response to your question, but to your very good question, but it's the best I could come up with on the fly.
That's great. That's a great answer. Well, Stephen, we've taken up a lot of your time. We really appreciate you being on the show today. I was wondering if you could give us just a teaser, perhaps, of your next book, which you say is going to be a global history of the war on terror. Is that right?
Yes, it'll be a global history of the war on terror. It'll be pretty comprehensive because it will cover not just the diplomatic, military, and intelligence dimensions of the war, but will also cover its U.S. domestic political impact. And the way in which the war on terror affected Americans and reshaped, in a sense, U.S. politics. And that's that's a big claim. Whether I'm going to be successful in demonstrating it sort of remains to be seen. I think so, but that the beauty of that that will be in the eyes of the beholder. So and I think that's really important. As a project, because I don't think as a nation we've really come to grips with the war on terror and all its effects, not just abroad but at home. And if I can put things this way, I mean, a surprise attack, which is what 9/11 was, well, it could happen again.
Of course. Yeah.
It won't be Al-Qaeda, it'll be something else, but it will be a surprise. And nations, and we're looking at the situation in Gaza right now as a sort of a classic case, nations can really get torqued and even deranged by a successful surprise attack that is very costly, especially against the background of complicated and divisive politics, in the victim country. So it's important to establish, I think, the vast array of ways in which the global war on terror affected the United States and the world at large, so that if the United States is, God forbid, subject to another surprise attack that might even be much worse than 9/11, we're aware of the dangers inherent in a rash and violent response.
Well, thanks again for being on the show. We really appreciate it, and I look forward to reading your next book.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Really do.